Did magic, as you see it, did what would people generally recognise as magic, did that feed into science? Was it necessary for the push through the Renaissance? Was it an aberration, a throwback, a fakery, or did it become a progressive intellectually?
I think one thing it did, and the Hermetic text did, was legitimise a focus on nature. Suddenly nature wasn't something profane which should be escaped from. We've got, yes, the Neoplatonic ascent, but also focus and observation. Astrologers had to observe. And
but it was that phrase, as above, so below. Yeah.
Yes, and you really did get that. You got astronomers really making close observation of the heavens. You got alchemists. They're not dabbling. They're looking at the properties of matter. And yes, often there was a sort of spiritual motivation for this, but at the same time, it really did legitimize the fact that you could focus on material substance, as science does.
Most people today are familiar with the quote from Arthur C. Clarke, which says, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." But what I find increasingly odd is that while so many people seem to resonate with the truth of that adage, we don't at the same time seem to take it backwards to its inevitable conclusion, back to the implications this would seem to have about the origins of science and technology themselves. Would most people react as favorably to a type of inverted version of this quote? Would they also agree with a preposition such as, "Any primitively developed magic is indistinguishable from science"? Anyhow, I'm waffling a bit here, but the point is that the more we continue digging into the development of modern science, or rather scientism, with its rather glaringly false foundational philosophical assumptions such as evolution and Copernicanism, and perhaps now atomism as well, the more it really begs the broader historical question as to how we ever got to this point. In the Western world, many of us grew up in a culture and an educational system which, for the most part, has regarded the development of scientific knowledge as largely the product of some vague concept of the Judeo-Christian belief system. This generic idea that it was the Christianized nations of Europe and their colonial offshoots which, because they had this theistic foundation which taught that a rational creator would make the world in an orderly way and that which could be studied and understood, that enjoyed the intellectual climate most preferable for scientific study and development, producing such great scientific minds as Isaac Newton, Galileo, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Edison, Albert Einstein, etc., all those genius folks we learn about in school. However, this worldview does not hold up well to any decent scrutiny of the history of scientific thinking. Not surprisingly, it seems to be the Christian culture today that is most blind in this matter, preferring to cling to this mythology about the Christian roots of science, because it plays such a large role in the current approach to Christian apologetics and in familiar subjects such as creationism, where so many sciences such as geology or astronomy are turned to in hopes of vindicating the Genesis account. But when we listen to secular historians expound upon things that pertain to this development, the fuller picture is really not that difficult to begin to realize, especially if you're willing to lay down a lot of those rosy-colored, Christian-slanted views of scientific history in Europe, America, and the West. In previous pieces, I've delved a fair amount into the roles of both alchemy and the Kabbalah in the development of things like chemistry and atomic theory, as well as the development of Copernican astronomy and cosmology, in tracing the occult mystery school root of what today we may refer to generically as the religion of scientism. But there is another strand of occultism which played a huge, significant role in the progression of scientism, and that strand was the introduction of Hermetic philosophy into Europe towards the beginning of what we now refer to as the Renaissance. The figure of Hermes himself, as well as the documents which bore his name, shed an incredible amount of light as to how ancient esoteric teachings penetrated Europe and gave rise to the periods known as the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and finally the scientific and industrial revolutions. It is rather astounding to learn just how highly regarded the figure of Hermes Trismegistus was to the European Renaissance mind. He was considered by scholars from Augustine to Thomas Aquinas to be not just a literal figure of history, but a pagan Egyptian priest who somehow, apparently because he was believed to more or less be a contemporary of Moses, he was viewed as sort of this quasi-patriarchal figure. They really elevated him essentially to the same level as like Moses or Abraham, but as this kind of extra-biblical prophet who they argued gave credence to Christian doctrines such as the Trinity, though coming from a clearly non-Hebrew origin. So here we have the figure of Hermes, the quintessential magus, this pagan magician from antiquity who somehow comes to receive this incredibly favorable treatment by European Christian theologians and scholars, alongside Europeans who are of course much more deeply attracted to the occult elements of his tradition. And so in the 15th century we have the Italian scholar, a Catholic priest, Marsilio Ficino, who's been commissioned by the wealthy Medici family to translate the works of Plato, and yet when the Medici suddenly came into the possession of a Greek manuscript said to be the writings of the magnificent Hermes, Ficino was ordered to halt all work on Plato and translate the Hermetic text with the utmost priority. What resulted was the work known thereafter as the Corpus Hermeticum, and this volume, along with other works such as the Asclepius, began to be spread throughout Europe amongst scholars and Renaissance thinkers, being regarded as quite harmonious with the increasingly popular Kabbalistic writings, and rightfully so, since they're derived from the same occult origins. And all of this, quite plainly, was fairly inseparable from the spread of Copernicanism in Europe. While the Corpus Hermeticum contained a fair amount of more philosophical and ideological content, it also contained descriptions of outright occult rituals, such as how to summon astral energies down from above into stone idols and animate them, and so it is quite deserving of the categorization as witchcraft. One prominent figure within the rise of Copernicanism whose Hermetic influences have been thoroughly documented is the well-traveled figure of Giordano Bruno, who first proposed that stars are distant suns, and he was killed by being burned at the stake. Francis Yates, a 20th century historian who specializes in Renaissance history, wrote an entire book on this titled Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, which you can now read online for free. See the link below. Copernicus himself referred to Hermes in this quote about the sun. "In the middle of all sits the sun enthroned. In this most beautiful temple could we place this luminary in any better position from which he can illuminate the whole at once? He is rightly called the lamp, the mind, the ruler of the universe. Hermes Trismegistus names him the visible god. Sophocles Electra calls him the all-seeing. So the sun sits upon a royal throne, ruling his children, the planets which circle around him." Isaac Newton is well known to have been an alchemist and a student of Kabbalah, supposedly having endeavored to translate the emerald tablets of alchemy, but he too was a student of the Corpus Hermeticum. So we have Nicholas Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, all heavily influenced by Hermeticism, and of course Francis Bacon as well, whose writings would seem to eventually inspire the creation of the first official institution of scientific study, the Royal Society. Interestingly enough, there's been a fair amount of research done by numerous people examining the founding members of the Royal Society and their connections to both Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. Francis Bacon, the famous occultist who is credited with basically being the father of the scientific method, wrote the well-known utopian novel New Atlantis, which described the creation of an ideal college dedicated to human discovery and knowledge, called Solomon's House. The Royal Society was in many ways the blueprint for science departments and universities in the centuries that followed. And I believe this is the phase in the historical progression where the occult roots and influences were quite successfully whitewashed from the enterprise of science, as it morphed into the more contemporary concepts of natural philosophy and scientific materialism we're familiar with today. But Yeats argued, and rather convincingly in my opinion, that without that influx of Hermetic philosophy in the 15th to 17th centuries, there would quite simply have been no scientific revolution. Without the magical traditions of Hermeticism, which focuses on the influences of things on each other, on their interconnectedness in nature, and on the practices of observation of these influences in hopes of learning how to understand them and manipulate them, as well as the classification of phenomena and the elements of nature. Without all these things, there's just no such thing as science as we know it today. One thing that's really started to startle me, honestly, as a Christian myself, is getting to this point where I've actually had to stop and recognize that if these influences of alchemy, Kabbalism, Hermeticism, and also Neoplatonism, which we haven't discussed much, but if these hadn't entered in, then we're left with a somewhat uncomfortable question as to whether or not the Bible, on its own, would have ever inspired people to the level of scientific study and technological advancement that so rapidly occurred in this time period between the rediscovery of all these ancient occult teachings, which is the Renaissance, i.e. the revival of occultism, and the modern day. Many people have equated Bacon's New Atlantis with the founding of the United States of America, with its pervasive Freemasonic origins and all the esoteric symbolism of the streets of Washington, D.C. and so on. But I have to say that this theory probably has a lot of truth to it, but at the same time, it's probably just a part of the whole. If the building of, quote, Solomon's house was fundamental to the creation of that Luciferian utopia of the New Atlantis, i.e. the one-world system, then I now have to think that in all probability, this massive thing that we call scientism is really just another term for that same overarching thing, the reintroduction and reestablishment of those ancient sacred sciences, or 7 liberal arts of antiquity. In the days of the early Christian church, it was combated as Gnosticism, the heresy of the mystery school teachings, which was constantly trying to embed itself within the orthodox Christian gospel, whereby the acquisition of knowledge, or gnosis, was central to humanity learning to save itself. But I ask you, how is the current understanding of science, which means knowledge, really any different?